Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the sixth lecture in the Current Issues in Irish Media seminar series. I'm delighted to welcome the Irish Times online news editor, David Labanyi, here to the university to talk to you today. David has been at the cutting edge of the development of online journalism in the Irish Times over the last 15 years. He's going to talk to you about how online journalism has changed the working experience and demands on print journalists today. As you all know, the advances in technology have made the generation of news a 24/7 service now that needs to be fed, edited and monitored. He's going to talk to you about the need for all journalists to have multimedia skills, to be able to produce several versions of the same story, one for print, one for online, and also to be able to post your own short videos with a story. He's also going to talk about the new paywall that the Irish Times has introduced and the reasons for its introduction and the implications for the newspaper. David is actually from Limerick, and before becoming the online news editor, he wrote extensively for the Irish Times finance department and also on transport and road safety issues. And he's a native of Limerick, so I'd like to give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for the introduction and for coming along to this seminar today. Very quickly, my background: I went to college, feels like a long time ago. I did arts, hadn't a breeze what I was going to do to get a job after that. Ended up doing a postgrad in journalism in DIT, then got a job, which I was very lucky to get. Actually, it was a very good step. The Irish Medical Times. It gave me a year's full-time reporting experience with a small organisation. I learned a lot from some very good people. Then joined the Irish Times in 2000 as an online news reporter. Then moved to their finance department in 2006. And in 2009 was appointed online news editor, a role I've had since then. I'm going to run through a couple of different bits and pieces, which I think if I try and recall back to when I was sitting in your seat, I would have found interesting, and hopefully some of this will be of use to some of you. I will take questions as I go. If you want to ask a question, just put up your hand. I'll answer it as best I can, and then we can have a slightly more detailed discussion at the end. So if there's anything that I'm saying that doesn't make any sense at all, or you'd like more information on, just take a note and we can speak about it a little bit later on. The 6 main points that I'm going to run through with you today. Basically, I'm going to talk about what's changed in journalism because of this move to digital. What's happening in the Irish Times is not unique. It's part of structural change within the industry. From your point of view, you need to be aware of it because it will dictate to a greater or lesser degree where the jobs and the opportunities are going to be for you. I'm going to explain to you more specifically what the Irish Times is doing, various changes we've made, particularly in the last couple of years, and we've made a lot. I'm then going to show you what those changes mean in practice. To a greater or lesser degree, that's going to mean what my day looks like, what a day in the Irish Times newsroom looks like now that we've become a digitally focused organisation. And then I'm going to go through some of the key differences between print journalism and online journalism. One of those is data. We know what our readers do, when they do it, and to what extent they do it. We have phenomenal data on our readers, something that we never had in print, and that allows us to make some quite interesting decisions. And then I'm going to tell you something else that is something that's really just become an issue for us in the last 12 months, and that's basically finding readers. The fancy word for that is search engine optimization, but it's really just a fancy way of saying how do you find readers, and we're putting increasing amounts of time and thought into how we get our journalism to the right readers. And then the last bit I'll talk to you about briefly is the paywall, what we did, why we did it, and why we think maybe this time it'll work. Most of you will know this is the second time the Irish Times has tried a paywall. What does digital mean in terms of journalism? Well, it means that over the last decade there's pretty much been a revolution in the media world. There's about 3 elements of that, one of which is a lot of newspapers have closed or have gone from being weekly publications to sort of being a couple of days a week, or in some cases just weekend only. It means there's new players which don't have legacy print products attached to them, so they're your HuffPost, Politico, your Vice, your Journal, a whole range of different organisations who are selling news, and that means changes for journalists and what we do. New technologies are a massive thing. There's probably no single more powerful implement in digital at the moment than this, the smartphone. It's probably the most important thing for media for the next couple of years. More so than desktop, more so than iPad, simply because this is with your potential readership every moment of every day. And these are now so high quality in terms of the types of data they can take, ability to look at things like interactive graphics, the quality of video playing on these types of devices. It's revolutionizing journalism as we know it. An awful lot of news organizations, the Journal is a good example, they've actually designed their entire website around mobile, and then they reverse engineered it to make it a desktop experience, but their starting point was mobile. Mobile is also the single biggest area of audience growth, and we expect that trend to continue. So, and I'll show you some slides later on that show the movement of audience from desktop to mobile. This change presents different reader expectations. Readers are phenomenally demanding. As organizations change, readers have increased expectations in terms of when stories are available to them, what formats, levels of details, levels of interactivity, and that's leading to a constant reappraisal of the kind of product that is available. So, for example, anybody interested in sports will know that over the last couple of years you've moved from sort of a small match report at the end of an event to live blogs. In many cases you've live galleries, you may have streaming, you may have clips of key moments in matches, you've got almost instantaneous reaction from players, coaches, fans, and then you've got analysis pieces landing almost within minutes of the final whistle, all driven by reader expectation. And as one or two organizations start doing this, others feel compelled to follow. So there's a constant process of change as a result of this. The good news is this move to digital also means some new opportunities. We now have a video department in the Irish Times. We never did. We hired about 8 people about 18 months ago. So we have a video news editor, we have a head of video, and we've got about 5 or 6 videographers, basically journalists with high-level video skills, video and editing skills. And they work across the organisation. They do live news, they go to marketings, they go to events, and then they do sort of different type of pieces. Some would be more analytical, they'd be based on explainers of major events of the day, or they might be more colour-based sort of interviews, or sometimes slightly more quirky bits and pieces. Then there's other new elements that would have never existed sort of 5 or 6 years ago. We now have a data blog, we now have a data team. So we have people allocated to coming up with data-driven stories. So you'll have seen some examples around Sinn Féin finances. We did quite a lot of work on that in the paper, but actually the origins of that project was an online project which was interrogating the available data that we had around the fundraising activities of Sinn Féin in the US. It ended up being so interesting that it sort of led to a reverse engineering for a print product, but its origins was as an online product, and that's where most of the information was contained. And increasingly that's one of the areas where we're finding that we can kind of set ourselves apart from some of the other online news organizations, because there is a cohort of readers who want to be able to be given that kind of information, and maybe they want to read the news story we've written, or maybe they want to look at that information themselves and draw their own conclusions. And that's a big part of sort of the Irish Times and how we try and present news. We present it as neutrally as we can, and then it's over to the readers and let them form their own views. The other things to bear in mind around digital is the revenue shifts. So in the old days, you had a publication, you sold the publication, you got a proportion of the sale price, and then the advertiser, if they were nice, would give you some money as well. That's completely changed. Quite a number of organizations have gone down the online road and are staying, to date, they say they're staying free. Some organizations like The Guardian can do this because they've got very large amounts of money that they got from selling Auto Trader. A lot of other media organizations are realizing that the historic balance between part subscription revenue and part advertising will probably need to remain in an online world. It's going to be difficult for organizations to exist purely on advertising and yet have the resources that they may require to invest heavily in journalism. It's a difficult balancing act. The FT, New York Times and others have shown that there is a very good future for certain types of media organizations with a part subscription-based model. Our understanding of that is basically organizations which have a specialization or an element that sets their reporting apart from others. For example, the FT have the greatest chance of success in this area. And then just one final thing, obviously one thing about the move to digital is there's lower entry costs. The difference between setting up a website, at least initially, and trying to set up a print-based product are very different, and that's led to a proliferation of new players, and they're all serving niche areas of the market. This has completely changed our lives. My working life has changed very significantly over the last 10 to 15 years. We pretty much operate from about 5 in the morning until about 2 a.m. So we're not quite 24/7, but we're getting there. At some point we'll probably get there, or very close to it. The structure of our day has completely changed, and I'll speak to you about that in a little bit more detail later on. And sort of a bigger takeaway is for an organisation like the Irish Times, which is about 150 years old, over the last 10 years we've effectively moved into operating more like a broadcaster. So we're now operating to sort of half-hourly and hourly deadlines, whereas previously they would have had one deadline probably around 9:30 in the evening, and the entire day was based around working towards that. The challenge for a paper like us is how to compete and survive in this kind of world, and I'll explain to you what our thoughts are around that. I'm often asked when I speak at events like this whether a move to digital means a loss of quality, and sort of the process of verification, fact-checking, does that diminish? No would be the answer. If we have an option of being first, that's what we want to do, but we'd rather be second and right than first and wrong. And we would take verification, fact-checking just as seriously online as we would in the paper. I would spend at least as much time, if not more, on the phone to our lawyers checking something is legally sound as my colleagues on the print desk. We've often been beaten to a story because we spend time that we consider to be essential to make sure that the story is correct. There's a number of reasons for doing that. Obviously there's our reputation. Financially it makes an awful lot more sense than getting things wrong. And then it's the trust the reader has in our organisation. It's one of our selling points. We really do try and get things right if we can, and we will sacrifice being first with the story if that's what is required. I'll also talk to you a little bit about sort of the changing revenue models and what's happening there and the various decisions that people are making around that. And then one other thing is aggregation, and this is something that a lot of news organisations in the digital world are sort of battling with. In bigger markets such as the US, you can have sort of genuine aggregators, maybe like the Huffington Post, which can draw from a huge range of organisations and pull in bits and pieces and almost provide sort of a sample or a taster of what's going on. It's more of a challenge in smaller markets, and within the Irish market, there's maybe only 3 or 4 major content providers: ourselves, the Indo, RTE, the Examiner. So there's a tension between so-called aggregators and original content producers, and increasingly there's a view that as some organisations go behind a paywall, it may be easier for them to defend their content because the content isn't free at first instance. This is the view from Kevin O'Sullivan, the Irish Times editor, on what's happening in the media world at the moment. It's just interesting to have a quick run through it. He says every editor across the world is wrestling with this digital media revolution, factoring the expectation that all content should be free, and it's a very challenging market. The migration of the audience online has changed everything. The Irish Times is changing with that, following the audience, serving them at every turn. Our online audience is substantial and growing. We're now a digital-first organisation. We changed about 2 years ago. What does that mean? That means that if a journalist comes into work in the morning, they answer to the digital desk first. So it doesn't matter what they've been asked to do for print, they have to do whatever they need to do for online first. That's their first port of call. Digital is first call and resources. So if it's a question of doing item A for the newspaper, item B for online, item B normally wins, unless it's in extremis. Now obviously these are not absolutes. Every day you'll have sort of particular decisions to make, but effectively it means our focus is serving our digital readers first. And that's meant we've gone from having sort of a small online focused team predominantly serving the website to people like me being able to call on the entire newsroom or in the entire organisation. Any feature writer, any news writer, any finance writer can all be asked to do something for digital pretty much at the drop of a hat. Our goal is to give our online readers fast, authoritative, as in correct, rolling news and analysis, which again is increasingly an area where we are trying to compete. RTE are very good with providing news. The Indo is good with providing news. Where we are trying to set ourselves apart is we're trying to use the expertise of a lot of our writers and get that expertise onto the website as quickly as we can by way of analysis. It sets us apart. It's not only giving you the news, but the why behind the news as quickly as we can. And our readership figures suggest that that's something that our readers like and are consuming quite heavily. The other elements that we're looking at, data, we've discussed that a little bit, but we have a data blog now and we have a data team, and we're trying to provide a fairly regular stream of data-driven stories. Some of that is fairly straightforward stuff, but it's based around presentation. So we ran a piece recently looking at the change in the patterns of babies' names. So we were able to look back at the number of children called David or Mary or any other name based on CSO data, provide an interactive graphic that allowed people to go and look at their own name and look at the trends and what's happening. And we put that on our website, and it was in the top of our most read for probably 4 or 5 days. Huge number of international shares, several 100,000 page impressions in that particular article, phenomenally well shared on social, and it's a very good example of information that's out there. You know, it's CSO published, there's nothing unique, nothing special about the information, but we'd taken it and presented it in a way that was engaging to readers and made people interact with something that was just there, sort of lying on a website somewhere waiting to be picked up. So you've got stories like that, and then you've got stories like the Sinn Féin finance stories, LuxLeaks or others, where there's genuine investigation and you're trying to bring something new to the public domain. But data is a big area for us. Analysis we've spoken about. We also are increasingly trying to bring good writing as opposed to news reporting onto our website. We now have at least one full-time member of the features team is working to the news desk, working on the second floor, and pretty much every day we'll give them sort of a task to come up with something interesting, something a little bit offbeat for people to read. So it's not just a constant flow of straight news, that there's some light and shade there as well. So some recent ones have been pieces about Mother's Day, pieces about Stephanie Roach and her second goal, various other different things. But it's taking sort of a sideways look at the world. And again, we're finding that that kind of balance with just the hard news is working quite well for us. We have a video team. They're producing probably about 3 pieces of video a day. That would be unique Irish-based video that we've shot and produced ourselves. Sometimes it's linked to a rolling news story, sometimes it's a sort of a standalone piece of video, and then they would also bring in pieces of wire copy, so a piece of video from Reuters or elsewhere, and edit that to our standards. It's opened up a new area of verification and challenge for us. So some recent examples were and I should use the word alleged here, macing or pepper spraying of a man on the street by a guard. We got video there from a member of the public, and there's a process there in terms of verification, checking with that individual, checking the authenticity of the video, checking with the guards before we're in a position to use it, and even then it needed to be edited so that the individual guard couldn't be identified for legal reasons. We also had similar issues around the Paris shootings. We had considerably more video and access to video than we're in a position to use for taste and decency and other reasons. But it's introduced a whole new level of sort of a verification and editorial judgment for us. One big issue with video, some of you may have come across this, but if you're at a protest and you're filming protesters and some of the witty and humorous and colourful placards in the background are saying things that defamatory are likely to get you into legal bother, you need to be very careful with that. As a result, you're going to have to edit the video quite heavily, because very often people writing placards aren't aware that what they're saying is likely to be defamatory. If you video that and then broadcast it, you're defaming somebody. It doesn't matter if whatever is said is in the video is very sort of a bland or generic. If there's defamatory material in the background, you're in just as much trouble if somebody said something silly. And again, that's an editing job, and it's a judgment piece. We now have an audio department as well. We've got an audio studio in our newsroom. We've got 2 people who are full-time audio technicians. They produce our podcasts. So we've got a politics podcast, finance, sports, world, and we've also got the Second Captains, who some of you may know used to be on News Talk. They've now signed a contract with us and provide a number of sports contracts, podcasts for us every week, and they do very well for us. We've also developed live blogs. We run a lot of polls to try and get reader engagement going. We have comment on some of our articles, not all. Comment is a challenging area. What we're finding with comment is that in a non-sort of login situation, people were basically going online and saying stuff that they would never normally consider saying if they're speaking to somebody face to face. So we introduced a login or registration system for comment. That has improved matters to a degree, but we still have a view that some people abuse the comment system, particularly when it comes to female writers, particularly when it comes to certain subjects. And there is a debate at the moment in a lot of newspapers about the extent to which having certain articles open to comment is actually improving the level of comment around some of those subjects. Some of the comments are really just not conducive to producing a good debate around an article. We have some articles open at the moment, but we have some concerns around that as well, and it's sort of an open question for us in terms of how we deal with that. Those are some of the elements that we use to try and sort of move beyond just the straight words on a page type presentation of content, and those are some of the areas where we're trying to develop. So structurally, what the Irish Times has done over the last couple of years is go from having an online department that was in a separate building, a separate team, about 100 yards away from the main Irish Times office, sort of a separate standalone organisation. I think even structurally we're a separate company. To integrating this and bringing the staff and putting them into the main newsroom. Most of our roles now have become dual roles, particularly for reporters, particularly for production staff. So staff now work cross-platform, so some production staff will come in the morning, they'll be told they're working either in print or in online. Reporters work to both, there's no distinction, we don't have online reporters anymore, you're just a reporter and you'll work to whatever you're asked to do by the news desk, including the online desk. The news desk is now one large news desk with online as part of that. The commissioning process has changed, so we now have web published deadlines, so a reporter may be given a rolling requirement in terms of filing, or they may be given a web specific deadline, or they may be given a print deadline. That applies for news and analysis. We also have deadlines for galleries, graphics and social media publishing, which I'll speak to you a little bit about in more detail later, but basically this is one of the major growth areas for us. A significant proportion of our traffic, probably about a quarter, is now coming from social. Our main channels are Twitter and Facebook. We are putting a huge amount of effort into how we present our content on these channels. In short, that's where the readers are. And we now are very close to going down a similar road to The Guardian and effectively having a bespoke standalone social media team who will basically look after this element of our publishing for us. It's one of the areas that we're becoming increasingly aware of, that we spend a huge amount of time planning content, writing it, researching it, subbing it, getting it all as good as we can, and then we're web publishing it really rather quickly in the context of the amount of time that's given to its creation. So we're trying to put more thought into how we publish content once we've created it. In brief, the media future is digital. It really doesn't matter what organisation you go on to work for. Pretty much every media organisation is going to have some kind of digital arm, and increasingly I would argue that digital arm is going to become more important over the coming years. I think more print newspapers are going to shut. Variety of reasons for this, but I think it's quite a crowded market at the moment, both in Ireland and in the English-speaking world. So you're probably going to see more changes and consolidations in the Irish print market over the next 5 to 10 years. And I think at the end of that point it's going to look quite different. I also believe it's very important that countries are well served by sort of quality, what I would deem as quality or well-resourced news organisations. There was an interesting piece of research carried out in England about 3 or 4 years ago, which was looking at some of the implications of the crash there. And one of the findings was that because of the predominance of tabloid newspapers, which would have a slightly different sort of raison d'etre to broadsheet or so-called broadsheet newspapers, people were actually quite poorly equipped in terms of the financial information they needed to make good decisions around things like health insurance, mortgage rates, car loans, hire purchase rates, stuff like that. And there was actually an information deficit available to people around the kind of information people need to make good decisions in their day-to-day lives. And then sort of from the bigger point of view in terms of keeping an eye on what's going on. The Irish Times has, we've done some things relatively well, some things we might have done a little bit better on. But for example, the Bertie letter story, which a lot of you will recall is kind of a landmark in Irish political life, and we remain the only organisation to be, or individual to be punished around that, financially or otherwise. The Trichet letter, which we published recently, basically explaining why we weren't going to be allowed to forfeit on any of our debts, or the Lux Leaks, which looked at basically what big companies are doing via various tax havens. There's a certain kind of organisation that can do the requisite research and work on those kind of stories, and I think it's organisations possibly closer to an organisation like what the Irish Times currently is than maybe others, which have a sort of a very different mandate in terms of what they're giving to their readers. Amidst all this change, there are positives. As I mentioned, there's a number of new organisations, and there will be other new organisations. For example, the Sunday Times is currently hiring 5 or 6 experienced journalists. They're going to bring out a daily online e-paper. Now they're behind a hard paywall, so unless you're a subscriber you won't see it, but basically it's going to be a daily Sunday Times type product. They're going to take some Irish news, much the same way as they do with their Sunday newspaper, and they're going to bolt on some sports and some other bits from their English Times paper and create a daily offering over here. The Sunday Business Post has created a daily sort of online offering. I think others will, and then you've got some of the organisations mentioned there. There will be new opportunities for journalists, and also as well the broader sort of economic upturn means that there's probably more hiring going on now than at any point over the last 4 or 5 years, which is a good thing. The other thing to bear in mind is, in a digital world, the potential audience is a multiple of whatever you might have ever hoped for in pure print terms. So the Irish Times audience, if you factor in digital, if you factor in our e-paper, you factor in print, has never been higher, and it's growing, and it's growing quite strongly. And it's one of the areas where we're quite optimistic, and it's one of the sort of the basis on which we decided to go down the paywall road. Our overall audience has been growing quite strongly for the last 3 or 4 years, despite the broader economic difficulties. The other thing to bear in mind is readers are increasingly better informed. They have a huge variety of news sources. If they're interested in a particular area, there's a very good chance that they've read quite widely around it. We're finding that the feedback we're getting from readers is increasingly becoming more demanding. We take that as a good thing. And that hopefully should drive elements of the quality market. There's some very demanding readers out there. Who reads us now? We've about 300,000 print readers according to the last survey, about 400,000 daily digital users. That translates broadly into about 44 million page views per month. That puts us third in the market, but it depends how you rate RTE. RTE is interesting because they throw all their figures in, including sort of people watching shows and so on and so forth. So RTE would be first, Indo second, and we would be third. We have 6 million unique users. So a unique user, for those of you who don't know, is basically a device as opposed to an individual. A device. And that uniques figure is kind of becoming a little bit debased because so many people have multiple devices. Like I've got 3 iPads, 2 smartphones, a work desktop and a home laptop. So that's 5 or 6 unique users, but I'm only one individual. So that figure is becoming a little bit debased. We're more interested in the page views and some of the other metrics that are available to us. About 160,000 downloads of our podcasts. Video views regularly exceed about 100,000 a week. Video and podcasts are seen as being very interesting areas for a whole range of reasons, largely because people generally engage with them for a fairly decent period of time. They don't just sort of flick through them as they're at the bus stop just scanning through headlines. They normally make a conscious decision. I'm going to listen to this piece of audio, I'm going to watch this video. And we normally find that some of our most engaged readers, so readers who like our content the most and come back to us most frequently, are very often looking at some of these types of pieces of content. We've about 20,000 digital print subscribers. That's a mixture of people taking our e-paper, taking home delivery. We plan to double that within a year. That's part of our sort of broader paywall strategy. It's a fairly modest target, and we'd be fairly confident about hitting it. That's one of the big other changes in the market in the last couple of years, is the number of people going from just buying the newspaper daily in the newsagents and being a subscriber and having it delivered to them. And that's actually an area of growth for us in a broader context of print sales being in decline. What happens when I come into work? The first person in the door is normally in at 6. In fact, they're probably in before that, actually. Increasingly, people are in at about sort of 5:30. That's when our breaking news service starts. So that person comes in, they basically find out whatever has happened overnight. They get a note from the overnight team saying these are the stories we're working on, these are the areas you might need to develop, these are the problems, this is the stuff that's worth checking. This could be everything from crime to international stories to stuff that we haven't published yet but we're working on. I'd normally start at 7 a.m. Normally a news reporter would start with me, and at least one and usually two finance reporters. And then the editorial director will come in about 7:45. From the outside, it's kind of hard to get across the importance of this, but what this means is the third most important person in the company, in editorial terms, is now starting at 7:45 in the morning. And that's probably about 2 hours earlier than they would previously have started. They sit beside me in the news desk, and it's basically a change we've introduced since we went digital first. And the change of focus structurally as a company that has arrived as a consequence of that is huge, because it means people in a very senior decision-making role, people who can commit resources, who can send people at the drop of a hat to Israel if we decided they need to go there, or to Paris, as we did on the morning of the Paris shootings. The editorial director said, right, Ruan McCormack, go home, get your passport, you're off to France, and can do that without having to sort of go further up the decision-making chain. That's made a huge difference, and it's greatly enhanced our responsiveness and our ability sort of to make decisions very, very, very quickly. We then have an online news planning meeting about 8 a.m. Basically, that's kind of the people who are listed on that page, and a couple of others, normally a politics reporter who starts at around 7 as well. Sometimes our politics reporters start earlier because we do a daily politics digest, but there's normally one of them around 8 for that meeting. At that meeting, we decide on the 2 or 3 main Irish news or Irish business stories of the day, and what we're going to do, who's going to do them, and deadlines. And normally as well, another very senior member of the editorial team, Cliff Taylor, former editor of the Sunday Business Post, he does a lot of early morning analysis on business and politics story for us. He'll normally have a chat to us around that time of day, and if, for example, on the morning when there was a development on the Aer Lingus story, or quantitative easing, or the launch of the new political party, Renua, which is just a wonderful name, he'll make sort of a decision, and we'll have a conversation about whether he's going to be in a position to file an early analysis piece on some element of the news. And very often that piece will be delivered before I go to conference at 10:30. We normally have a traffic update at 9 a.m. and that'll basically look at what happened to the website the previous day, what our overall traffic was, what the top 10 stories were, where the traffic came from, where they went on to read. We've got phenomenal data about what happens, and I'll show you that later on. And then our main editorial conference is now 10:30 in the morning. It used to be 2 p.m. So what that means is we can make decisions about what we want to do early enough for us to be able to get that content written and ready and on the website for lunchtime. And as I'll show you when I show you our sort of a plan of our traffic, our busiest time of the day, traffic-wise, is between noon and 2. And that's where that's kind of the sweet spot where we're trying to make sure content is available for that largest section of our audience over the course of the day. So we're making our decisions far earlier than we used to. Another consequence of that is by making decisions that much earlier, by writing content that much earlier, it's available for print production people earlier in the day as well. And that's helping us sort of smooth out the production process later in the day, whereas previously an awful lot of content landed 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening, and the poor print production fellas were losing their minds trying to get it all ready and on a page to meet print deadlines. Then we've got another meeting in the newsroom. This is purely dealing with pagination, so what stories go on which page. That happens at around 2. Then I would normally hand over to my late equivalent. So this is another change we've introduced. We have an early and late breaking news person, whereas previously we just had one. Then they have a front page conference at 5, and that would be basically a list of 6 or 7 stories. Whoever's on the news desk would say, these are the best stories we have, and the editor or somebody acting on behalf of the editor would make a decision about what the front page stories would be. And I should have mentioned, after that, we'll normally make decisions around what will be on the front page of the website the following morning as well, and how the website will look if you go and look at it at 5 o'clock in the morning. Our international print deadlines are at 9, so those are we have copies of the Irish Times available in Spain and London and a couple of other places, so the international version of that has to be ready basically about 9 p.m. It's sent to our various printers. Final edition is normally, the deadline is normally around 11 p.m. And the first paper is back in the office by about 12:05. Our printing press can knock out about 140,000 copies in an hour. So it's a phenomenal operation if you ever get a chance to have a look at it. We build the front page of the website normally between about 10 and midnight. So from about midnight, 1 a.m. it's live. The only differences there the only exceptions there would be if we have an exclusive story that we don't want somebody to follow up. We will very often delay the publish until around 5 or 6 a.m. It makes it harder for some of our competitors to get that story either into their print publications or onto their websites early in the morning. And we've done that a number of times. Broadly speaking, what the sort of move to digital means for us is all departments start earlier, decision makers are available earlier and are making decisions earlier. We're broadly working towards targeting that lunchtime peak. We'd also make a lot of decisions around 7:38 about off-diary stuff. Some of these things work, some don't. A lot of our sort of politics analysis pieces, we would do at least one piece of political analysis every day. Sometimes it's following the news agenda of the day. Sometimes it's something a little bit different that we're kind of interested in or curious about. We normally make those decisions quite early. We're always paying attention to analytics. I'll show you exactly what tools we use. And images as well is a big thing for us. Every article in the Irish Times has to carry an image. We use far more images than the newspaper. That's opened up a constant dialogue between us and the print desk. And there's very often decisions to be made, such as some of you may recall, those images of the O'Donnells emptying their house of furniture last week. An intrepid photographer was, I understand, hanging out of a tree somewhere when he took a photo. It was available to me when I came in at 7 o'clock in the morning. It was going to cost us some money and we had to make a decision, was it worth it? And we were able to make the decision early enough to get the maximum out of that decision. There's no point making that decision at 10:30, 11 o'clock in the day when the story's already moved on to the courts and so on and so forth. So, broadly speaking, our competitive strengths, on any given day, most of the main Irish websites will have, broadly speaking, the main stories. Everybody's going to have a story about the Graham Dwyer trial. Everyone's going to have a story about the Ian Bailey trial. If the O'Donnell's case is on, we'll all have a story about that. If there's a major running political story, we'll all have a story on that. Where we try and compete is expertise. Most of our reporters are specialists. We only have 2 general reporters in the newsroom. Everybody else has a specialist area of responsibility. We've got a couple of people who are on trainee programs, but broadly speaking, almost every reporter we have has an expertise, and that's what we're trying to leverage. That means our reporting, we're kind of inverting the original theory about the web in terms of web stories being shorter. Very often our web stories are a little bit longer. We've no space constraints, and what we're finding is if the piece is well read, or well written, well constructed, readers is already interested in that area. If you're giving them a better quality story, more detail, chances are they're getting a better experience with us, and that's what we're hoping. And then we're hoping they're going to return, and then we're giving them analysis as well. So we're trying to move beyond just a flat news report saying X happened and deal with the detail, the background, the explainers, the Q&As, and the analysis. An example I give of what this means in practice is one of the many actually O'Donnell court hearings last week. This was on the Friday. Our chief reporter, Carl O'Brien, was sent to the court by the online desk, so he was to file for online. And he was sending a combination of text messages and email when the Wi-Fi would allow to the news desk, and those were used to construct a rolling news story. So if at any point over a 1 or 2 hour period you looked at our website, you got as close as we could provide a real-time update of what was happening in the court at that time. We weren't waiting for the court to finish. We were telling you what was being said at court, the various arguments being made, and then providing some context about why they were in court and why this was important and why you should care. While that was happening, our most senior layout person, somebody who used to be formerly our chief sub, who now works online, was creating an interactive timeline explaining how the O'Donnells managed to get themselves into legal bother, their various rows over the last 6 or 7 years, and was updating it in real time so that when he was finished, it would reflect the outcome of the court case that was currently happening in front of us. And while he was doing that, our legal affairs correspondent was writing about what happens next. So why would the O'Donnells be dragging some of the most eminent people in the forecourts through the courts for what looked to be, on the face of it, a fairly forlorn exercise in terms of delaying what was in it for them. So he's trying to explain that to readers. And this was all happening as the case was ongoing. The objective being that as soon as the case was finished, or indeed at any time while the case was live, somebody coming to our site would get as good as was possible to provide a combination of news and context and interactive elements that would allow them to understand what was going on. We're a little bit like Bolton, I suppose, to use a footballing analogy. We're very good at set pieces. And when we commit to a set piece, we really do. And we've taken the view that we can't cover every single story well. So we choose some stories where we think we have a particular expertise and a particular strength, and we try and leverage that as best we can. From our point of view, it's really only the Indo that can sort of match that kind of breadth of coverage element. And they would have different focuses in terms of the areas they hit. RT are very strong, obviously, in broadcast, but in terms of the written word, they won't have a 500 or 600 word analysis piece. They don't really do colour. The Examiner also has different aspects and the Journal, but we think what we do is a little bit unique within the Irish market, and that's what we've been working to develop. This section is going to deal with analytics, and really this is just, if you're sort of a bit of a data wonk like I would be, this is just phenomenally interesting. We know everything about our readers. Like, we know that people who tell our reader surveys that they read the Irish Times editorials, we know they're lying. We absolutely know they're lying, because we know exactly how many people read the Irish Times editorials every single day. We know what time of the day they read them. We know how far down the article they go to. We know what article they came from. We know what article they go on to read next. We know whether they came from Facebook or Twitter or via the main Irish Times site or from an email. We know a phenomenal amount about our readers. And this quality of data is really, it's a huge distinction between what's available to people working in digital and what's available to people working in print. We basically know what works. We know what people are interested in. Now, the caveat with this is obviously you can't slavishly follow that, because if you did, the Irish Times would look very like some organisations, which I won't name, which have pictures or galleries of Sports Illustrated models and various other things which they just know will be very heavily consumed. But it's a phenomenal guide in terms of what's going on, both in terms of content and also in terms of structure. So when you're an organisation like us, you're publishing maybe 250, 300 pieces of content per day, times 7 days, times a year. We've 1.3 million pieces of content in our archive. It becomes a sort of a structural question around how you organise all that information, so that readers can navigate their way around the site and find what they want to read and what they're most interested in. So this, the analytics here are hugely useful for us. This is a little bit humorous, but it's kind of interesting. If you were to look at our most read articles and try and come up and close your eyes and come up in your mind with sort of what the composite Irish Times reader would be, it would be a rugby playing cat with a large property portfolio who argues about abortion in the Middle East in the rain. So that's all. You look at all the key stories. So some property stories do very well for us. Politics, particularly around abortion. Middle East is a huge issue in terms of readership. The weather is a massive issue. Rugby is a massive subject for us. So, at its zenith, you could create sort of a composite reader. Obviously, that's not who our target audience is, but the analytics will tell you that these are the kind of stories that can play very well, and you can get a phenomenal level of detail, whereas previously in print, you were relying on whether a story was picked up on radio, whether you got letters about it, whether other newspapers followed it up. It was a much less refined sort of understanding of what the readers thought. And just to reiterate the point, we're not in the clickbait game. We could be if we chose, we're not. There's an audience there. There's the potential for traffic there, but we see it as being a very crowded market. We don't see it as being a market that is in keeping with sort of the Irish Times charter and what we're trying to do. We do try and have a sense of humour. We do try and sort of have a mixture of light and shade, but the Sports Illustrated galleries we leave to others. So what do we know from our analytics? We know what you read. We know how far down an article you read. So if I open up one of those articles individually, I can see how many read to the first paragraph, to the second, to the third, to the fourth, and see how it tails off. If there's a particularly sharp tail off at a particular paragraph, it's usually a signal that somebody's made a balls of it, and that paragraph needs to be looked at again because it's confusing readers and they're not going beyond that point. I know what device people read on. I know if it's on what type of phone. I know if it's on an iPad. I know if it's on a desktop. I know what they go on to read next, where they come from. We also know which links within an article people are clicking on. We know whether they commented or not, and then from that we can build up some kind of a profile. Now, we don't have registration for most of our sites, so we don't know things like age or gender or things like that, but we really do have a very good idea of somebody's reader journey through our website. The other thing we can do is, with Chartbeat, we can put a heat map over the front of our index pages, which allows us to see which sections of the page people are clicking. So we can see if a particular article in a particular slot is doing very well or doing very poorly, and we may need to make certain decisions around this. Many websites, including our own, have a sort of a big sort of image display option at the top of the page. We call this the hero slot. Basically, it's the part of the page where your eye naturally will land if you look at it on a desktop-based screen. Normally, articles that are presented there perform very well in terms of traffic. If they don't, we've probably made an error in terms of how we present the content, or maybe the content is just poorly chosen. One of the sort of learnings for us out of the analytics is we're increasingly becoming aware that people are interested in different types of content at different times of the day. Whereas previously it was kind of a bit of a catch-all. We sort of threw everything over the gate and hoped for the best. Now we're increasingly realizing that people will more likely to consume news first thing in the day, probably up to around lunchtime. They're more likely to consume op-ed pieces around lunchtime, the middle of the day, usually around sort of lunch breaks, and they're more likely to consume longer read featured pieces in the evening. And as a result, we're tailoring how we're publishing stuff on social media with that broad sort of dynamic in mind, and we're constantly tweaking it to see what works. Content that would work quite well at 8 o'clock on a Friday may not work equally as well at 8 o'clock on a Saturday. So we're constantly learning about what works and how we should respond to try and find the best possible audience for a particular piece of content. That's important, actually. I mean, we would take the view that a lot of what we do is probably niche. So we're not trying to create viral content with every article we write. Some organizations may, we're not. When we create a piece of content, there's probably a natural audience for that piece of content, and our aim is to try and find that audience, or make it as easy as possible for that audience to find that piece of content. And I'll explain to you in a little bit more detail how we're trying to do this. So the analytics are incredibly powerful for us, and we've moved on from pure page views. We can now see things like engagement, so we know if you what segment of our readership read one article, read between 1 and 5, 5 and 9, 9 and 15, all the way up along, what countries those people are based in, what times of day they read content. We really do have some decent piece of information on which guys like me can start making decisions about what we publish when we publish it. So about 18 months ago, we probably only had one indicator in terms of traffic, and that was probably the same with many of our competitors, just pure page views. They're going up or down, that's all you knew. And it's a very crude metric in terms of what's happening on your site. Most organizations have more refined information now. We use Chartbeat. We also use Google Analytics. Chartbeat is the live tool. Google Analytics will give you sort of a day report. We use that for the morning traffic report. And then we're building our own bespoke one, which allows us to interrogate certain aspects of the data where we don't really have the kind of information we want, so we're building our own. So we know, the basic implication is we know our readers, our online readers, far better than we ever did before. And in any sector, you need to know who your readers or customers are in order to serve them as well as you can. We're not chasing clicks. We think there's an audience. It may not be a mass audience, but we think there's an audience for high quality Irish news, politics, business, sports content. And we also believe that content has a value. And it costs us an awful lot to produce it, costs us an awful lot of work to produce it, and we think it has a value and it's a saleable commodity, and that's why we've gone down the paywall road. Just so you know, in terms of our audience breakdown, broadly speaking, about 40% of our readers are outside of Ireland, mainly English-speaking countries, as you'd expect. We've done some things to try and leverage that. We've introduced a blog-type product called Generation Immigration, which on a whole different levels has actually been a remarkable success for us. It covers a whole range of issues, everything from undocumented Irish to stories about people living away, how you set up in a new country. Some of it is just synchronicity. It's good timing with the economic crisis and more people leaving, but it's also tapping into an element of Irishness that I think traditional print papers had struggled to cover well, because obviously there's no audience in it really for them except the people left behind. Whereas what we're finding with this blog is there's an international audience for us. There's a way for us to make contact with people living in countries like Australia, like Thailand, Japan, Argentina, a whole range of different countries, and tell us how they're getting on. And it's opened up quite an interesting dynamic, and that's one area where we've seen sort of, from our point of view, quite a good success, and we're looking at other ways of hitting sort of audiences or groups that maybe the traditional media haven't reached to date, largely because of format rather than reader interest. This section is about SEO, and it's another sort of difference between print and digital, in that with a print product, you put it in the shop, somebody comes along, they pay their money, they pick it up, and you kind of take for granted that they've read it and they know everything that's in it, or they read whatever they want. So the reader comes to you. What we're finding in a digital world is you have to go and find the reader. And the fancy word for this is search engine optimization, but it's basically trying to get your content in front of the relevant audience. And this comes back to what I was saying earlier about we're increasingly spending more time and attention on how we publish content online, when we publish it, and the way in which we present it. As part of this sort of broader thinking, we recently did a sort of a training program in the Irish Times explaining to an awful lot of our production people some of the basic tenets of search engine optimization. And the main sort of finding out of that is you can't present a piece of content which would work perfectly well in print in the same way in digital. They have to be treated totally different. In headline and other key area terms, the piece of content itself may be fine on both platforms, but the way in which it's presented has to be a little bit different. And in this section, I'm just going to run through some of the main points. And the reason I'm doing this is for anybody working here or goes on to work in a digital organization, trying to get whatever content you're producing or working with in front of as wide an audience as possible is going to be part of your remit. There's absolutely no point killing yourself trying to produce a really good piece of content and nobody can find it. And these are some of the broad principles that we use, which I think would be, they'd be applicable in most organizations regardless of size, although I accept the Irish Times as a sort of a particularly large player within an Irish content. So this is basically how we try and ensure our content finds its maximum natural audience. We accept some pieces of niche. It's worth bearing in mind probably about 70, well, it depends on the week, 60 to 70% of our audience goes to about 20-25% of our content. So a relatively small proportion of our content takes the majority of our audience. If you were to follow that to a logical conclusion, you'd only work on the 20-25% of your content and sort of not get too concerned about the rest. But we're trying to serve a slightly broader spectrum in terms of covering Irish life. Google is the overwhelmingly dominant search engine in the market. It defines how people search in other search forums, including on the Irish Times. You need to be aware of how it works to make sure your content can be found. When you link SEO with analytics, you can very often spot if there's a problem with the way in which an article is performing. If an article you thought would generate a good or a strong audience reader reaction is actually performing very badly, sometimes that's a hint that you've presented it in a poor way. So what does it mean in practice? It basically means trying to clarify the content of an article out of context. So if you take a traditional print publication, you have a whole range of pieces of cultural reference. So you've got the date of the newspaper, You've got the page it's on, so you know it's home news or world news. You may have an image with it. It may be on a page that is grouping other relevant pieces of content, which is a little tag at the top saying Dáil page or O'Donnell case or Ireland versus Wales or a whole range of other references. And it may be sort of the morning after a particular event, so the context may be implied. You can't assume that that same context information is available to an online reader, possibly because they're not living in Ireland, so they may not be listening to the same radio programs you are, possibly because they may not be looking at the article on that day. They may be looking at it a week or 2 or 3 weeks further down the line. So one of the major sort of differences between presenting content digitally and presenting it in print is context. So a digital headline has to provide the context for the article. And that's one of the major areas of change that we've tried to introduce. It's not just about clicks, so you're not trying to mislead readers, you're not trying to give them information or sort of lull them into thinking that an article is about something that it's not really, because the sort of slightly obtuse element is maybe more interesting or sexier than what the actual article is about. Some organisations do that, and some organisations get phenomenal traffic out of doing that. That's not what we do. Our view is if you mislead people about what the true content of an article is based on the headline, you're just going to upset them, annoy them, frustrate them, and they'll probably stop coming to your site. So it's short term, it may work for you in terms of traffic. Longer term, our view is it's not the way to go. So what we're looking for is the widest relevant digital audience for a particular piece of content. Also, in sort of, and this is maybe more of an issue for sort of larger websites like the Irish Times, but if you perform well in SEO on an ongoing basis, you're going to end up with a sort of a Google ranking, which you can either enhance or degrade depending on how you do certain things in an SEO context. A good Google ranking is a desirable consequence. It basically means your content is ranked higher in search. So why do we bother? Simply because search and social combined are our biggest source of readers. So more people come to us via a combination of Google News, Facebook and Twitter than come via the front page of irishtimes.com. That is a pattern that has emerged over the last 12 to 18 months. There's no sign of that trend changing. So that's how the readers are coming to us. So that's how we're trying to respond. Like many organisations, I think far too much of our content was probably published without thinking about how it was going to appear digitally. And up until recently, we had an over-reliance on print headlines. They were just being transferred over. And I'll show you some examples of what that means in practice. We're using SEO to try and help our breaking news perform. Google News and Google operate slightly different criteria, and a good performance in terms of SEO, in terms of explaining to people what you're writing about, can help how your news is ranked. And just something to be aware of in breaking news terms, but also more generally in content terms. Most content dies in traffic terms within 24 hours. So if somebody hasn't read your article within 24 hours, they're probably not going to read it. And they're definitely not going to read it if it's got a poor headline, which is vague, and they won't be able to pull it up if they do a search, either on your site or on Google. And that's just... It's a fact of life. Part of that is a volume game. There's 120 million web pages published every day, leading to an overall web total, which was, last time I checked, 5 or 6 billion web pages out there. It's an awful lot of competition if you're using sort of broad engines like Google and fairly broad search terms. Some of this is on the edge of being commercially sensitive, but we'll clatter on and see how we get on. But this is basically a slide showing where our readers come from. Forgive me if those on the back can't see the figures, but basically the blue bit is the important one. It's the big one. It's organic search. That's basically Google. The red section is direct, people coming to the home page. The green section is social, so that's Facebook and Twitter. And that figure's increased, so those figures are a little bit out of date. That's October 2014. And the purple section is referral. That's Google News, which operates slightly different to the main Google search, and I'll explain how. And then the others are smaller. These are the trends. So what you can see pretty much is what's happening to those figures over the course of a year. And what you can see is organic search is holding pretty much flat or stable. Social is growing very strongly. Direct is tailing off from a high of around 4 million, and the others are holding broadly steady as well. This also gives you a quick sense of what medium or what social channels people use to come to our site at different times of the day. What you can see, interestingly enough, is Google is very strong in the middle of the day and there's a peak at the end, as with Facebook, whereas Twitter seems to be a much more constant source. Our view on that is very simple. It's basically people have phones beside them all day long and they're constantly checking in, whereas with Google and Facebook, they check in at certain times of the day. With Google, it's looking like sort of an evening peak, maybe when people are home from work, kids gone to sleep, whatever it is, whereas Twitter is a much more constant source. And this is what they read. So you can see how many readers read 1 to 9, 10 to 25, and then what we would class as heavy readers, 26 plus articles per month. And then these are the devices. So the interesting thing here is this is a September 2013 figure. The blue bit is desktop, it's 57%. It's the dominant device in terms of sending readers our way. Website, mobile phone is basically people looking at the mobile app of our website, and website tablet and apps. So you can see the figure there, and then you go 1 year forward and desktop is no longer the largest. It's down to 47%. It's now less than half. That trend, if anything, has increased since September 2014, and it's all going to mobile. This is going to have huge implications in terms of how content is presented and organized, because most websites, including our own, are structured around the basis that the predominant device used for consuming the content is desktop, and that isn't going to be the case in 2 or 3 years' time. Quick word about Google. Some of you may know this, some of you may not. There's more than one. How Google Search and Google News operate is different and will give you different results, and you need to be aware of how both operate if you want your content to fare well in both. The algorithms crawl pages looking for new content and indications about what that is about. Google can only read text. So if you do something funky, let's say like words on top of a picture, or you've got certain content in video or in audio, Google can't read any of that. It can only read text. It can read the title of the video, but it can't make any judgments around the content of the video. Same with audio, same with a lot of graphical or data-based information. It can only read text. It indexes the web pages based on the content, and then it ranks them based on a whole range of criteria, including the search term and how closely that relates to what the reader is actually searching for, your site ranking, and a number of other criteria I'll discuss. And then it places a different level of importance on a range of fields, which I'll explain. So these are the criteria. It's basically 200 signals, according to Google. Now, Google is not entirely forthcoming when it comes to how their algorithms work. Commercially sensitive. It's their secret sauce, so they protect it. But the information they'll reveal and what we can divine is about 200 signals, which all added together will determine whether your piece of content ranks relatively high or relatively low when somebody searches for a piece of journalism in Google. The key criteria is relevance. So if your article is about water charges, you're going to get back a chunk of results about water charges. Google has introduced a semantic element to it, so it can determine that if you're searching for water charges, you're not searching for how much does it cost to buy a glass of water in a pub. It knows you're talking about the issue of water charges in an Irish context, domestic charging for water services. So it has an element of semantic search in that. Links are seen as being very important for Google. That's how it follows. The Google algorithms follow through a chain of articles on a website using the links. So a new piece of content published today on a Wednesday, linked to a piece of content published yesterday on a Tuesday, and on Monday and on Saturday. Google will follow all the way back and will re-index the piece of content from a Saturday on the basis of following that chain of links. So for a large volume publisher like ourselves, it's a way of trying to keep some of our slightly older content surfaced in search terms. And structurally, if any of you end up going to work on websites, how you organize and base sort of contextual articles related to the piece that you're writing about, how you link those to what you're writing about is quite important, because it both brings the older content back to the front in Google's terms, and also from a reader point of view, if you give a reader an article which is both the today piece but then linked to a whole other series of relevant articles which they may be interested in, you're providing a better reader experience. On the right-hand side, it's some of the top 10 of ranking criteria in order of relevance in as much as we can define them. So it uses relevance, site authority. Site authority is basically your past performance measure. So Google places a site authority on every website based on how accurate information is, the performance of articles, the traffic, things like typos, for example. If any of you have a slightly, and I'm sure you don't, of course, but if any of you have a slightly unfortunate incident to drop the odd letter here or there, as I have been known to do, it really spangles Google because it can't read misspelled words, it hasn't a breeze, and it just thinks it's spam and confuses it really badly. So the site authority would go into the quality of the information, and your site authority is kind of like inbuilt. So it's for a given Irish Times piece, let's just say hypothetically speaking, our site authority is X. That means our article starts 25% higher in ranking terms at the very, very beginning compared to other relevant articles from other organisations. So your site authority is important. It's built up over time, and the higher the site authority, the higher your articles are going to rank. The search term, obviously, so if you're interested in water charges, if water charges is in the article, it's going to score more highly. Originality. Google's interesting. Google has an interesting tension relationship with a lot of news providers, and I'll give you an example of this later on, but it claims to reward original content, which, according to Google, should benefit content producers or people who basically don't just copy and paste. I have an interesting example around that, but it claims to reward original content. Freshness or timestamps to you and me. So if one article about a shooting somewhere is more relevant or is more recent than another, the more recent one will normally rank more highly on the basis that Google is making an assumption that a more recent timestamp should include new information. It can't impose any qualitative judgments about the quality of the content, so it uses a timestamp as a measure of judgment. This is the quality spelling and grammar issue, which Google imposes, and it's not based on US spelling, it's based on the site or the country-based spelling. Links, keywords, site architecture, some of the other stuff you don't really need to worry about, but broadly speaking, if you consistently produce good content, Google will reward you for that. This is a quick example that I ran. This is general Google search for water charges. November 20th is the day after the government caved and changed the rules around water charges. What you see is an interesting mixture. It's a change Google introduced at the end of last year, around September, I think. They're mixing news results with citizens information, irishwater.ie, blah, 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 blah. So you're getting a mixture of both. In theory, this should be good for anybody who's producing news stories. So that's the context. It was the day after the new water charges. There was around 18 pieces of content on irishtimes.com about this. We done one article in the first page of results, which from my point of view isn't great. And we probably did a couple of things wrong on that day. And ideally in Google, you want your content on the first page. That's where our piece was. There was a Q&A down the bottom of page one. So it's blending its search results, and our hope is that that's going to be good. And we have actually seen an uptick in our referral traffic from Google since the change. Something else to be aware of if you're wondering why something you've published has done well or less well. Google is also sensitive to trends and location and your past searching history. If you want to find out if one of your pieces of content is doing well on Google, you need to clear your cache or set up a private browser session to get a pure search result. Otherwise, it's going to make some search decisions based on what you may have searched for previously. Google's also sensitive to sort of the context of search terms. So if there's a sudden burst in activity for a search term, let's say like the Late Late Toy Show, nobody searches for it 11 months of the year. There's a burst of activity for it sort of 2 or 3 weeks out of the year. It's aware of that and it responds accordingly. The other thing is the semantic search function means Google will often auto-suggest a search term when you start writing. So if you key in the word water into Google, it'll very often auto-prompt water charges or some other search term. And just be aware of that if you're wondering what search term to put in a headline, and don't necessarily deliberately run contrary to the Google auto-suggest, because most people are naturally time pressed and they'll pick the auto-suggest and their search results will be governed accordingly. So that's what happens when you run water charges through Google News on the following day, and you get one set of search results, and then through main Google, and then through Google News you get a different set of results for exactly the same search term on the same night, probably within about 2 or 3 minutes of each other. And the reason for that is Google News only searches news sources. It places more emphasis on recency, and it claims to dislike aggregated content. So just, if any of you go on to work in digital-based organizations and you're trying to figure out why your content is doing well or some pieces are doing better than others, if you're looking at Google, there's basically two different bases of decision going on between Google and Google News. There's actually a third Google as well, just to complicate matters, but this is purely a volume proposition, so it tends to be the larger publications. But basically this Google, if you just go to Google News Ireland and no search term, you're going to get a list of stories. These are entirely driven by volume. So whatever's most read is normally popping in at the top there. It's a phenomenal traffic driver. Being at the top of that slot can help an article perform very, very well. And normally the articles that are sort of, they're grouped around the subject, but normally the articles that aren't in that sort of top slot don't perform nearly as well in terms of traffic. So Google, is it the only search engine out there? So if you're creating a piece of content, you want people to find that content, you want to secure the maximum number of readers. Well, this is what it means for us. It's the dominant one, and then you break that down into sessions. Nearly 5 million for Google, and the rest are absolutely nowhere. So Google is by far and away the major source of traffic in terms of search. This is more of a philosophical question, but it's worth thinking about. Is having so much of your traffic dependent on one sort of search engine? A lot of news publishers are wondering about this. Google is in a phenomenally powerful position when it comes to search. Although on the plus side, it's kind of easier to just work out what one search engine is doing rather than many different ones. And broadly speaking, the same SEO principles that will work for your own individual site and that will work for Google will pretty much work on all search engines. This is an interesting little anecdote. This is what happens if you piss off Google. There's a German publisher called Axel Springer who about a year ago declined a request from Google to give free licenses for its 4 titles in Google. So that basically means Google asks for permission to license its information, to make it available for a whole range of different things, including selling ads beside them and a range of other different services, as it does with a lot of content from different news sites. So Axel Springer said no, and on October 23rd, according to a letter written by Axel Springer, Google turned off the tap, which means it changed the site ranking that the Axel Springer sites had, and it changed a number of other different criteria, and the consequence was nobody could find any of the Axel Springer content when they went into Google, because they dickied with the search algorithms and nobody could find it. They lost about 40% in traffic volume. Google News fell down by 80%. According to Axel Springer, the cost was a 7-figure sum, a large 7-figure sum, and they reversed. They couldn't sustain it, and they gave Google the free licenses. On an individual basis for you right now, it's probably not going to be an issue, but just more broadly speaking, when you're thinking about the concept of online journalism, who owns it, who can find it, it's one thing having it, it's one thing having a site, but if nobody can find the site, and for example, if people like Google and others, for whatever reason, aren't working in your favor, it's almost as good as having no site, because you won't have any readers. This is just a quick example of some of the kind of stuff we've been talking about in terms of writing good content, trying to find a reader, and then the problems you can run into with really simple things like a headline. So can anybody suggest to me why that headline won't work if you went looking for it either in the Irish Times or on Google or anywhere else?
Just say the Late Late Toy Show.
Exactly. They've split the search term. So if you're sitting at home and you want to read about the Late Late Toy Show, and if you actually type Late Late into Google, it'll auto suggest Late Late Toy Show. And if you put Late Late Toy Show into Google or into the Irish Times search engine, it won't return this article because the search term is split. So if you're trying to write a piece of content, and let's say you want to write a piece about crime in Limerick or something like that, you need to put the key search terms together in a way that a search engine or any other website can find. There's no point splitting them and breaking them up, even if you think it's going to make sort of a more elegant headline. You can do that maybe in print, but in online, you have to be almost as prescriptive as possible in trying to make it very clear to the search engine and anybody reading it, this is what this piece of content is about. So there you see, there's the auto suggest. That's a clean search engine, so I've cleared all my preferences. That's a clean search, and it offers Late Late Toy Show or Late Late Show guests. And as a result, that article, which was published on that day when I did that search, and there was quite a lot of articles about a Late Late Toy Show on that day, that article was nowhere to be found, even though it's a piece by Shane Hegarty. He's a good writer. There's an audience for that content, and on that instance, because of the way we presented that headline, we didn't find that audience. So the piece can't be found. This is another classic. This comes back to the point I'm trying to make to you about context. So if you write a piece of journalism with a headline and various other elements for print, it can look great on the day in question, and even this on our website looks okay because you can see Miriam Lord's byline. It's a Saturday, you probably figure out it's a political column, you recognize these guys. It's not disastrous. That's the print headline that was used on it. Miriam Lord's pieces are a little bit sort of left of field and usually have a slightly esoteric headline on them, but that was the presentation. So we took the print presentation, put it online, just about get away with it until you send out a tweet, and the majority of people would be baffled if they saw that go through their Twitter account. Some might, out of pure curiosity, click on it, but quite a lot probably won't. And that's an issue where the context, in terms of how you've presented the content digitally, has failed to appreciate the many different ways in which a piece of content can exist online. And a headline like that probably needs to include the keywords Miriam Lord, because Miriam Lord is a writer in her own right. People will look for what she writes regardless of subject, but equally somebody seeing that come through their Twitter account or on their Facebook page or in some other social channel with Miriam Lord in it knows in an instant that's what this piece is about. It's a piece of political commentary. You either want to read it or you don't. With this, you're not even giving the reader the option, and in my view, you're making it quite difficult for a reader to make an informed decision about whether this is a piece of our content that they'd like to read about. This is another classic. This is, anybody guess what this is? I'm sure somebody can guess. Yes. It is the main piece on our website the day after the most recent budget. It is the print headline. There's a problem. No, nowhere. That article was tanking when I came into the office. There's literally hundreds of pieces about the budget the following day. That article by Arthur Beasley, our politics core, sort of the Irish Times wrap, right up to the minute, sort of written 11 o'clock in the evening, as up to date, with as many of the calculations that we could have worked out on budget day in it. And it doesn't say budget anywhere, and we just had to burst in and change it. It looks very crude. It probably increased the readership by a factor of 10 to 12, maybe more. And as a result, that article performed very well when you combine it with our site authority and a range of other different things. If any of you are in a position where you are working for a media organisation and you're publishing a large volume of content around a particular thing, so electric picnic, budget, local and European elections, whatever, you can't win with all of those articles on the same search term. So if you put budget 2015 in front of, we published 78 articles on budget day online, you can't put budget 2015 in front of all of them, because then you're basically competing with yourself and everybody else is using the same search term. What we would do is we would use that key search term, and that is the key search term. Like, that is a term that is trending on Twitter. That is the most searched for term in Google. That is the key search term. We would put that in the top 3 pieces of content we have. We put it on our live blog, our main story, and our main points, which we find as a way of sort of digesting the information works very well for readers. Everything else would carry a search term more specific to the article. Tax changes, PRSI, mortgage relief, childcare, fuel costs. You'd use different search terms. They would all be linked, but in terms of presenting large volumes of content, you need to make it as easy for the reader to find what they want. But this was just an example where a print headline just did not work at all for us online and had to be changed. Some golden rules about digital headlines. They are fairly straightforward until you see them not being used. It has to work out of context. And out of context, I mean day of publication, page, a location, time of year, all of that. It has to work on its own. And very often that means starting from scratch and thinking, if I was looking for this piece of content on Google, what would I type into Google? And then constructing your headline around that. Not mentioned there, but just to let you know, Google has a short attention span, gets bored after about 75 characters. So if you would think the Daily Mail writing 3, 4, 5 line headlines was on something, they're not. They do that for different reasons. But about 75 characters, it's about 6 to 8 words, depending on the length of the words. That's about as far as Google reads. If you're going to put a search term into the headline, put it to the left. Google reads left to right, as do most search engines. So just bear that in mind. If a headline or the way in which you present content doesn't work sort of without the associated image or day of publication, it's probably not going to work for you digitally, and that means nobody's going to see the content that you've put an awful lot of work into creating, and that's obviously not what you want to do. And then the other thing is just try and bear in mind that we've gone a long way beyond just publishing content onto newspaper websites. We now have somebody whose pretty much full-time job is constructing Facebook posts, tweets, different variations of tweets, and other forms of social publishing to try and find the right audience at the right time for the right piece of content. So a piece of content is going to appear in a whole range of different sources, and most of which will be outside of the sort of the context of a traditional print page. The last thing I'm going to talk to you about quickly is paywalls. And why did we put one in? And are we mad? Why did we put one in? Well, simply, as I explained earlier, we have a view that what we do is unique within an Irish context and has a value. We're also of a view that the history of media, of private media, so not your state-funded organisations, the history of private media has broadly been two revenue streams, advertising and subscription. Depending on the market, either subscription is the bigger part or advertising is the bigger part, but broadly speaking, it's been a sort of a two-income stream model. Some organisations are purely ad-driven, they're free sheets, they're giveaways. That works to a degree, but what you tend to find in those kind of organisations is they don't have the revenue to be able to carry the editorial resources to do the more in-depth stuff, the LuxLeaks, the Sinn Féin expenses, the very, very deep coverage around elections, detailed business coverage, stuff like that. So our view is an advertising model alone, long term, is probably not a stable basis in which to try and build a large media organisation. We believe in our product, we believe it has a value, and we also believe that a certain proportion of our readers would be willing to pay for that. Now, it's important to say that we have a leaky paywall. So that means a certain proportion of our content is free. You get an allocation every month. It's 10 articles. If it's a desktop, it's higher. If it's on an app, that reflects usage patterns and locations and a range of other things. But basically, it's not a hard paywall like the Times. I think the Times of London lost 92 or maybe 95% of their traffic, maybe more, when they went behind the hard paywall. Our view is we're looking to find a way of establishing subscription relationships with those who read an awful lot of our content, people who maybe read 20, 25, 30 articles a month, and yet still have the kind of people who only read 1 or 2 of our articles a month be able to access the 1 or 2 articles a month of our content that they like, and we maintain a balance. There's a number of other organisations using a similar model. The FT, the Telegraph, New York Times. What do they have in common? They're probably closer to our end of the market than others. For the FT, it's been phenomenally successful. They really are. Hats off to them. They're really good. All of these organisations have played with what we call the meter. So that's basically how many articles you're able to read every month. There's a constant sort of reappraisal of that. Trial and error is a component of it. Some of it's to do with what else is going on in the market. But those 3 organisations have a broadly similar paywall product to us, and for all 3, broadly speaking, it's working quite well. For some organisations, it doesn't work. So I think it's the Chicago Sun-Tribune about 2 weeks ago, after 18 months of introducing a paywall, said, no, sorry, we're taking it down, didn't work, we're reversing out of that. They would maybe be closer to a generic news organisation, kind of mid-market. They're up against another organisation there that has a paywall and is very specialist in terms of finance and politics, and it just didn't work for them. There are other paywall models. The Times is a hard one, so you don't even get their articles in search results. They don't really publish that extensively to social. You're either in, have a subscription, can access it, or you're not. That's their view. It's actually probably been more successful than some of the early naysayers would suggest, but it's a particular kind of model, and it seems to be something they're sticking with, at least for the moment. And then there's other versions which would be sort of not quite a leaky paywall, but it would be a sectional paywall. So the majority of the site content is free, but the columnists are all behind a paywall, or the business section is all behind a paywall. That's another option. We decided to go with the leaky paywall. Generic news sites have struggled more with paywalls than more specialist ones. That's part of the reason why we've tried to position ourselves in the market in the way we have. We've been down this road before. Some of you might recall we had a paywall previously. That was about 10 years ago. The market has changed significantly since then, and at the kind of price point we're looking at, and at the sort of the pattern that people have of purchasing content online, such as Spotify or Netflix, where they have sort of ongoing, quiet in the background subscription services at a relatively low interest rate or entry rate, we think the market has moved on and people are now much more comfortable with paying for content online or certain types of content online, and that's why we're going back to it again. In retrospect, when we went in 2005, the market probably wasn't ready, although again, at that time, I think the market, our sort of sign up was probably at least in line with expectations, if not a little bit ahead. But we reached a point in 2008 where the feedback we were getting from advertisers was that there was more revenue available to us if we had a volume proposition rather than a specialist audience proposition. So we changed courses. Will it work? I certainly hope so. The early indications are that it's going quite well. I would not at all be surprised to see at least one, if not two others, follow us very quickly through the gate if we're successful. Some of the people in Ireland who most want us to succeed are sitting in newsrooms. Journalism is a very expensive product to create. If you look at it in those terms, it needs to be resourced. In a small market, it is kind of difficult to see how large organizations can fund large newsrooms, generating large volumes of high quality content, and other news organizations taking a slightly different approach to research can also operate. Legally, it is easier to defend content if you're behind a paywall, and there may be some interesting developments there in the future. And that's pretty much it. You'll be delighted to know. I'm happy to take any questions. I hope what we're dealing with was of some use, some interest, and thanks for your attention.